A lady in SoCal got shot because some lunatic didn't like the fact that she was flying a pride flag in her business. The victim, 66-year-old Laura Ann Carlton, suffered a gunshot wound. Carlton was pronounced dead on the scene. The suspect, who was not identified by officials, fled the scene on foot. According to deputies, the man made, quote, several disparaging remarks about a rainbow flag, end quote, that stood outside Carlton's store before ultimately shooting her. You know, I can immediately, predictably see all the bad faith right-wing arguments. Oh, how do you know it was a hate crime? It could have been a coincidence. They could have shot her over some other thing, and the flag comments were immaterial. What were the comments made? You know, it's not a hate crime to disagree with the trans groomer epidemic. Of course, you're not going to see much discussion of this because the left, and by the left, I mean left of center, so like Democrats or whatever, aren't really good at controlling the conversation. But, like, keep in mind, if there was a queer person who went up to a business owned by a straight white man with, like, a Blue Lives Matter flag and then shot that guy, it would be right-wing media for years. You would know the name of the person who did it. You would have their face memorized because it would be broadcasted everywhere. It would be international news, you know, a single murder, international news, because they would harp on and on and on. This won't get that much news, you know, because people on their left, and again, left of center, I mean, people left of center just aren't as aggressive in their weaponization of information like this and publicizing it or discussing it. I want every single right-wing politician to have to answer to this. I want them to be, you know, accosted with a microphone and asked, how do you feel about the fact that a person, you know, like that shit. That's what I want. Will I get this? No, of course not. Because a lot of people, when they see stuff like this, they just shrug and they go, oh, yeah, well, of course, the right wing's crazy. Well, just because you know they're crazy doesn't mean you shouldn't scream about it, you know? Imagine if I only gave one argument about how the right is crazy and transphobic or whatever, and I made that video back in 2019, then I shut up about it. It's like, oh, well, I made that point. No, absolutely not. Deputies were later able to locate the armed suspect, who was confronted by deputies and was killed in a lethal force encounter, authorities said. Look at that. Critical support for the cops, doing their job for once. An investigation into the incident still ongoing. Carlton, who went by Lori, had a husband and 9 children. So 9 children now are without a mother. Again, like, this should be just, like, hawked on national news for months and months and months. Just at every level made an issue. The way it would be if the situation was reversed, but it won't be. The Lake Arrowhead LGBTQ org took to social media to address the shooting, saying that while Carlton did not identify as a member, she spent her time helping and being an advocate for those in the queer community. Not even queer herself, just an ally. A good reminder to fence sitters that the lunatic transphobia of the right hurts not just trans people, but everyone who they see as complicit. You know, it is very much an all or nothing situation. You can't barter with or bargain with or moderate the topic. Anyway, you can tell by looking at her that she was cool. So that much is obvious. We're only going to see more of this, of course, you know. Stochastic terrorism from the right has been on the rise for a while. I imagine that following the results of the 2024 presidential election, if it goes down the way I think it will, or if Trump gets incarcerated, we're going to see another enormous wave of stochastic violence. The stochastic violence in and of itself is not a mathematically substantial issue. For instance, the number of people killed in political, like, homicides, you know, far right, far left, whatever, is incredibly small compared to the overall number of people who are killed for any number of reasons. Usually, stochastic terroristic violence is at its most significant as an indicator of general political trends when it targets specific people, like politicians. But it's worth noting that, you know, stochastic violence is more of a watermark measurement than anything else. I've talked about this before, and if you want more information, you should take a look at the Three Arrows channel, the video that he put out on the subject. But during the Weimar Republic in Germany, the courts and judges were generally very favorable to fascist values, you know, because think about it. It's the 1920s and 30s, and a lot of people in positions of power with high levels of wealth and education Well, they didn't like the whole humiliation of the, of the fatherland bit that they felt after World War One. A highly educated man 100 years ago was not exactly the soylent chugging liberal that you might think of one being today. A lot of them were very invested in what they imagined to be sort of like the glory and the reunification of the German people. They were very susceptible to that narrative, much in the same way that today very wealthy people are as well, right? Like very wealthy people tend to align with their business interests, so they tend to vote for the right and tend to abet fascism. When people showed up for January 6th, it wasn't like proletarians. It was largely like petite bourgeois, small business owner types, People with enough money that they could take time off work to go drive over to D.C. in their big pickup truck with all their fancy gear and so on, right? It's not like they were all poor. Far from it. They were wealthier than the average American by a good deal. So back in the Weimar Republic, obviously when the Nazis started getting louder and more prominent, you had acts of stochastic violence and terrorism committed by brown shirts, oftentimes against Jews or gay men, but they would do it against a lot of people. And there was a legal precedent that was more or less set in many German courts at the time. Basically, the argument being that if you did what you did out of a love for the fatherland, not the Weimar Republic, mind you, which they considered to be an illegitimate organization, but Germany, the blood of Germany, you could get off for murder. And that happened. Multiple brown shirt murderers, who unambiguously murdered, by the way. The courts didn't say, oh, you're found not guilty of murder. They said, oh, you did the murder, but you did it out of a love for blood and country. So you're free to go. That happened multiple times. It was a watermark moment. It was an indicator of what was to come. Obviously, our judges aren't really inclined that way. Like, that's not really how things work today. But I think that it's important to remember that the way the society you're in reacts to this kind of terroristic violence is a really strong indicator of how things are going to move forward. Does that make sense? Like, the number of people murdered by brown shirts before the Nazis took power wasn't that much. Like, I mean, tens of millions would die in World War II. Compared to all of that, the number of people murdered by brown shirts is a tiny, tiny, tiny portion. But it was an indicator of how things would go. And likewise, I feel the same way here. It's not like the far right's getting any less crazy. They might have to at some point, but not yet. Not now. Vosh, I strongly believe the GOP law proposals that permit running over protesters are analogous to what you just described. I agree completely. Florida's anti-rioting law will make it much easier to run over protesters with cars. After the Black Lives Matter protests, see, this is in 2021, the right got all stirred up about, the concept of people protesting. So Ron DeSantis pictured here, and there were a few other governors as well, but Ron DeSantis, I think, the most loudly. Here we go. The Combating Public Disorder Bill, which does not sound fascist, by the way. Florida's new law creates civil immunity for people who drive into crowds of protesters, meaning they won't be sued for damages if people get hurt or killed if they claim self-defense. But they could still face criminal charges. Democrats asked their GOP colleagues whether the neo-Nazi who drove into a crowd of protesters during the Unite the Right Charlottesville rally could have claimed immunity or self-defense. Quote, that person rammed a vehicle into those people to hurt them, GOP State Senator Danny Burgess responded, according to Orlando Sentinel. He wasn't defending himself. This is a lie, of course. Plenty of conservatives were saying that he did, in fact, drive into the crowd at Charlottesville to defend himself. That was a common conservative argument, to say that he was the one under threat by the protesters and that he just panic drove to save himself. And they would have made the same argument for him if they could have legally exonerated him for it. But yeah, no. So this would be an example of essentially the same thing, an attempt to, through one legal means or another, allow for stochastic terrorism. Is there a tipping point where the conservative craziness hurts their own cause? I would argue that's already happening. I would argue that we're seeing that right now. All the stuff they liked about Trump, the fact that he was a charismatic buffoon who didn't give a shit about procedure or law, is now coming back to him as he faces nearly 100 criminal charges now. So that's not great for him. Ron DeSantis is who was the spokesperson for the anti-woke talking points, has basically crashed and burned. He's gone. He's dead now. I think we are seeing that tipping point. It's never a clean and easy process. It's always messy. It's always, violent. Is Vivek a more dangerous fash than DeSantis now? No, Vivek is nothing. I don't think he's capable of really winning the presidency. I think that the sudden swell of support for Vivek, which, by the way, all happened after one Blaze TV showing, is just people who don't want Trump shifting from DeSantis, who's floundering and burning, over to another guy who has some attention. I don't think there's any meaningful long-term support for him. Yeah, the fact that he's not white would also definitely hurt his cause in the GOP candidacy. That is for sure. Is Vivek's run comparable to Michael Bloomberg's run? In some ways. Rogan was sucking off Vivek too. It was so gross. Well, Rogan's like a patsy who's just paid to say stuff, you know. It's not like he has any integrity as a commentator. Conservatives aren't going to want a President Ramaswamy. Yeah, probably not. Vivek's like Larry Elder. I just don't see much of a future for him. Koshigal, even if conservatives weren't racist, I don't think Vivek has much of a chance. He's not charismatic. He's kind of a weird loser. I don't see it. I don't see it. I don't think so. I saw this. Oh, man. It's never been more over than it is right now. Holy shit. No audio on that? God, look at his face, man. Where's the full thing? Muted? It's not muted. There's just no audio to that bit. Take it away. No, you're going to see more of him, in fact, in just a moment.
Your campaign said the other day that the knives are out for you at that debate. I got to ask you about that. Plus, I got to ask you, I know it's not your campaign, but Never Back Down put out a memo that people are talking about. So I'd like to get your reaction to both. Your campaign.
We'll just take that. Why does he look insane? Because he is literally Homelander, okay? He is a empty psychopath whose only driving belief is that he should have power, and he has the mind of a child, and he is totally uncharismatic. Like he's just him. He thinks he's him, and he's right. The video without the noise. I kind of like the noise though. I feel like it really adds to the emotional state. Fine, we'll watch the actual video, and thank you for finding it, by the way.
I know it's not your campaign, but Never Back Down put out a memo that people are talking about. So I'd like to get your reaction to both.
Well, on the memo, it's not mine. I haven't read it, and it's just, I think it's something that we have.
He's referring to that leaked memo where he's given really creepy, weird, specific directions for how to handle the Republican primary debate that make him look like cringe, and also say to defend Trump.
And put off to the side. But in terms of the debate, look, when I know from the military, when you're over the target, that's when you're taking flak. And if you look really in the last 6 to 9 months, I've been more attacked.
He is, but you also say it as if you're not a psychopath yourself, Falconaida. What? Wait, I'm intrigued. How do you know enough about me to know where I pulled my name from, but you're also weird enough to say that? Wait, who are you?
Than anybody else. Biden, Harris, the media, the left, other Republican candidates, and there's a reason for that because people know that I'm the biggest threat. So we view it as positive feedback. We'll be ready to do what we need to do to deliver our message, but we absolutely expect that and we'll be ready for it.
Hungry.
It means yes. It means defending ourselves, but more importantly, showing why we are the leader to get this country turned around.
Your campaign said the other day that the knives are...
I'm the biggest threat. Here's the latest GOP voter poll. Yeah, I did see this. This is why, like, actually psycho, like genuinely psycho. Feel what they tell you is true. Top answers among Trump voters. So, among Trump voters, who do you think is telling you the truth? And then Trump is 8 points ahead of friends and family. Actual cult. Like, literal actual cult. Insane. Mental illness. Absolutely wild. I will say, though, this is going to hurt them. This is the problem, folks. They have a Trump cult, so they can't move away from Trump. That's why DeSantis was instructed to not insult Trump during the primary, because they want DeSantis to win over Trump, but not at the expense of Trump. Now that it looks like DeSantis isn't going to win, it's essential that whatever candidacy for himself he promotes, it doesn't come at the expense of Trump support, which is why they're trying to shut down Chris Christie, because Chris Christie is kind of tearing away at the only person who has a chance of actually winning. Sorry, not winning. At like detracting from Donald Trump's victory. Yes, Trump is not going to be doing any debates, which makes him look incredibly weak. New CBS poll just out has me leading the field by legendary numbers. The public knows who I am and what a successful presidency I had with energy independence, strong borders, blah, blah. I will therefore not be doing the debates. It makes him look really, really weak. It does make Biden look weak that he and the DNC are trying to stamp in the primary process too. But the difference is, for one, the GOP actually is having a primary, unlike the Democrats. So denying the debate when there is a primary and people are talking about it is way worse than Biden just not participating in a non-existent primary, in terms of optics, I mean. Also, Donald Trump is known for being combative with a sharp tongue, so for him to, like, talk it all out, and then, like, him being afraid to show up in person, it makes him look really bad. Guys, I'm feeling really hopeful about 2024. I think it's going to be a bloody, messy process, and we're going to have to deal with a lot of insane bullshit and insurrectionary attempts and violence and blah, blah. But I genuinely feel like the scale is tilting heavily in our favor. And I wouldn't say it if I didn't believe it. I have never been afraid to say what I think is negative news here. And likewise, you know, I think that speaks to the sincerity of my positive beliefs. Do you think we'll see another Biden versus Trump debate again? If Trump doesn't get cut down by incarceration, if things go that far, then yeah, they'll have to. Because Biden will take that debate, and Trump refusing to do that debate would make him look ungodly weak. And that will be content. That will be content. And if we lose, the world ends, right? Well, the world ends whether or not we win or lose. It's just a matter of whether we get to feel smug and self-satisfied when the world ends. How does he have more support than Pence? Nobody likes Pence. Vosh will be smug and self-satisfied either way. That's true. That's why I'm always winning. What's the extent you anticipate conservatives will riot if Democrats win 2024? There are like a couple of possible scenarios that could happen, either if Democrats win or if Trump is incarcerated. Rioting is guaranteed. Protests are guaranteed. Selective rioting is guaranteed. The question is, will there be an organized insurrection attempt? Most, like, people like Donald Trump just wants people to give him special big boy applause claps. You know, he's not a big planner here. But there are people behind the GOP, you know, in and behind the GOP, who genuinely want to end democracy in this country. We're talking people who are willing to commit to this cause with the same ferocity that you would expect from coups that you've read about in history books. They're just waiting for their best opportunity. The problem is that Trump is their best opportunity. And Trump kind of fucked up in 2021, because of the Jan 6. And Trump seems to be the guy they're going to have to deal with in this upcoming election. And I have a feeling, because Trump will not run in 2028, there's no way, I have a feeling that there might be some kind of last-ditch effort by some people who want to see democracy ended, you know? Like, whether that be militia groups that are camped out in the mountains of the Midwest looking to do one, like, ride or die, like, shooting through a majority black neighborhood, whether that, you know, PAC donors, political operatives, funders, behind-the-scene types, you know, who want to try to finance, like, assassination plots. Is it likely that'll happen? I don't think so. Is it possible? Well, sure. We're talking about like, think of what's on the table here. Think of what they tried to do. They tried to do a fascist coup in the world's most powerful country, right? Like, you hear about coup attempts happening all the time in, you know, impoverished countries. The stakes here are 1 billion times higher, and they tried it anyway. So, yeah, of course, stuff like that's on the table, even if it's not necessarily going to happen. Maybe the people who want to do that, you know, they see that Trump's things up again, they throw their hands up in the air and they go, whatever, you know, we wanted to end democracy, but it looks like it's not in the cards. Now I'll just have to contend with being a wealthy fascist in a country that is still a democracy. You know, like, maybe that's the direction they go. I don't know. But I do think there is a real threat of something serious happening, you know? Which do you think was worse, the business plot or Jan 6? Jan 6. The business plot never came close to... The business plot was a plot. Jan 6 was a conspiracy orchestrated by some of the most powerful people in the country to try to overturn democracy. They made it farther. Do you think if another January 6 happened, they'd try the Capitol again to go for the White House? I don't know. By another Jan 6, I just mean an attempt at a coup. That could happen in a million ways in a million places. America is very difficult to overthrow the government because of how spread out the power is. The real place that you would want to go after with a coup, right? The real thing you want to rely on is you want the military on your side. And again, the military is not on their side, is the thing. This is one of the benefits of, like, entrenched liberal bureaucracy, which is that the people who lead our military, the people who run the Pentagon, are skewed heavily towards bureaucratic proceduralism. Are there lunatics in the Pentagon? Absolutely. I'm not denying that. And being a proceduralist bureaucrat is its own form of lunacy. But the people who get appointed to top brass at the Pentagon generally, not always, but generally, I think, are in operation, center-leaning America first political types. And by that, I mean, like, they exist as operatives of the state to serve American interest. If that means invading Iraq, they'll do it. If that means drafting crazy war plans with Iran, they'll do it. If that means, like, stopping white supremacists from taking over the Capitol, they'll do it. Like, it's apolitical, except for America wins. That's the politics. And this is the case in a lot of our, like, administrative state, you know? The FBI is like this in a big way. You know, the Department of Homeland Security, a lot of the people who work there, the IRS. Like, think about it, okay? The president gets to appoint, like, their cabinet heads, but for the thousands and thousands of people who work at the Department of Homeland Security, or, like, you know, the DOJ, or the FBI, or whatever, most of those guys are bureaucrats. Not crazy, like, political ideologues. Most of them just have government jobs. They have a lot of paperwork to go through every day, and they go through it. Yeah, the Department of Homeland Security operatives on the ground, like, personally, like, raping indigenous women at the border or whatever, they're lunatics, and they're heavily ideologically oriented. But for every ICE agent, or for every, like, you know, super ultra partisan general at the Pentagon, there are probably significantly more people who just think in paperwork. Does that make sense? The Pentagon, as it exists right now, is not a fascist organization. Like, the brass at the Pentagon are not all American extreme loyalists who envision a world of blood and soil stretching across the globe. That's not, like, that's not the doctrine. You know, when we do military shit overseas, like the invasion of Iraq, George Bush might phrase it as though it's a holy war where he's given instruction by God. And soldiers on the ground there might be white supremacists and might do white supremacist things and might torture people or shoot, breaking rules of engagement. But the overall plan maker, the gigantic, like, more than 1 million people involved in the Department of Defense operations, are pencil pushers. And this is a key distinction, and this is why, like, historically, fascism and bureaucracy tend not to go along that well, because bureaucracy is all about everything's on the books, everything's clear, file in triplicate, follow the rules, and fascist leadership is about narrative, screaming about blood and soil and getting people's blood worked up. But then what happens when it comes time to, like, you know, write that down and, like, put in business, or, like, it's like all of a sudden it kind of, like, falls apart, right? This happened in Germany. This happens consistently in fascist governments, where you have all this political will, you have, like, all these people being recruited, all this, like, on the human side of things, people are all fired up. But on the logistical side of things, that's another story. And you get larger and larger problems because, like, no pencil-pushing bureaucrat wants to be the guy to have to explain to Hitler that his plan won't work, you know? Because people in the position of having to do that tend to get fired or killed. So you'll have bureaucrats lying to politicians in order to go, like, yeah, we can do that. And, like, it keeps, like, getting fucked up. This happens everywhere. This happens everywhere. It happened with the Soviet Union, it happened with Germany. The only thing that can stop this from happening, well, you can never completely stop this from happening. But the thing that mitigates it, that increases the effectiveness of the liberal bureaucracy, is liberal bureaucratic governance. And the people at the Pentagon, the people in the administrative state, know this, which is why they tend not to get along with the fascists. Folks, does Donald Trump like or dislike the administrative state? I'll answer that one for you. He hates it. The whole Republican Party hates the administrative state. All of these departments, who the cabinet heads of which are appointed by the presidency, because they're literally like armies of hundreds of thousands of bureaucrats. And fascists don't like that. And the Pentagon's like that too. So the reason I'm going on about all of this is because this is something that really benefits us. The Pentagon is not a leftist organization. It's not a left-leaning organization. It's not a good organization. It's not acceptable in any way. They're horrible. But they're not horrible in the way that Trump needs them to be. They're not horrible in the way that helps them gel a fascist coup. Okay, just make sure it's known. This is not a defense of the administrative state. It's just an irreconcilability in how they function. It just doesn't work that well for them, which is why when fascist coups are going to happen, you need to have, or they need to have, a kind of like stronger entrenched support in these institutions. The military being a big one, but it could be a number of them. Stalin and the Soviets were obsessed with bureaucracy and didn't move a finger without papers. Yes, the infamous familiarity with bureaucracy for the Soviets. I mean, this is one of the things that everyone knows about them. And I'm not keen on defending the Soviet Union for a lot of reasons. And obviously, I've already indicated that, like, the Soviet Union did have a big problem with, like, ideologues versus bureaucrats. Because while Stalin may have operated a bureaucratic state, you'll never guess what Stalin did to lots and 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 lots of government and party officials who had information for him that he didn't like, you know? Like, right? Right. Yeah. Authoritarianism and bureaucracy, yeah. Issues arise. However, it is worth noting that, you know, for their general commitment to bureaucracy, they moved some mountains, you know? The Soviet Union, considering how disorganized and poor the country was, and how large the territory was able to maintain a surprisingly effective totalitarian apparatus over its citizenry. This was a degree of control that the Nazis were never capable of achieving. The Nazis mostly relied on fervor and group hysteria to get people really riled up, and if they heard anything even remotely treasonous or whatever from their neighbors or parents, they'll turn them into the government. But the Soviets didn't rely on that kind of, like, insane 24/7 bloodlust, partly because that just wasn't the doctrine of the state, and also because it's really, really difficult to keep that maintained for multiple decades, whereas the Nazis were only in power for a bit before the war started, and war does tend to bring about a sense of permanent hysteria. And no, the Soviet inclination towards bureaucracy probably helped keep them afloat for a lot longer than they would have otherwise. If the Soviets were as bureaucracy allergic as the Nazis, they probably would have collapsed in, like, I don't know, the 60s or something. They actually bureaucratized executions and persecutions too. Yeah, that's how committed they were to it. When the Nazi regime wanted to kill you for being a political dissident, the SS would show up at your door, you would be led to a government building, and no one would ever see you again, you know? You'd be shot in the back of the head and dumped somewhere. When the Soviets wanted to kill you, they would either falsify or misconstrue evidence against you, arrest you, put you to a trial with public record, have you jailed, have you publicly recant your not real crimes, and then send you to the gulag or kill you. It was like a whole, they'd make you confess, they'd falsify records, but it was very important to them that they have a paper trail for everyone's, why? Well, the whole myth of the Soviet Union was that it was a proletarian state, you know? Fairness was part of the doctrine. Fairness was not part of the doctrine of Nazi Germany. Nobody in Nazi Germany was promoting the idea that the Nazis were, like, fair, like that egalitarianism was a core value of theirs. If they disappeared you or killed you, they'd just say, oh, well, the person who was killed was a degenerate, you know? That's all they had to say. But in the Soviet Union, it's like, okay, so obviously, if this is a fair proletarian state, like, people who are executed have to have committed a legitimate counter-revolutionary crime. They have to be like, they can't just be a degenerate, you know, that's Nazi speak. They have to be like an enemy of the people, of the proletariat. So this process, this narrative requires more investment. It requires more effort to maintain. So it fit in well with their love of bureaucracy, for them to manifest this. Isn't there literally a Zizek bit on this?
More seriously, I liked very much what you said about comparing Stalinism, fascism.
Yes.
And I say this again as a radical leftist. It always, when people just throw them together into the same category of totalitarianism, I agree, there are good reasons for it. But the whole functioning of the system was different. Let's take the most extreme example of Stalinism, the purges. Why this compulsion to have people, victims, accused, publicly admit, confess their, you know, Bukharin and so on, confess their sins? You cannot imagine the same thing in Nazi Germany. It would have been meaningless within the Nazi universe to organize a big trial against the Jews where the Jewish leader would confess to their plot against...
Yeah, to make it clear how different they are, imagine the Nazis, like, having a fake bureaucratic judicial system falsify charges against a local Jew and then arrest them, torture them, but then have a public trial where the Jewish person recants their imagined crimes. This, like, This did not happen in Nazi Germany at all. Absolutely not. They would just be disappeared in a concrete building, you know? But they had very different styles of maintaining their total. Oh, isn't it interesting that we're talking about this right after Naomi Wu's disappearance by the CCP?
Against Germany, it's not part of their universe. Another thing which touched me.
What would be the comparison would be the Himmler and Heydrich and Goering confessing to being Soviet spies and in public and then being executed for that. That would be the equivalent
But
of
again,
what
as you
happened in
said,
Stalin's
it doesn't happen
It's
there.
unimaginable.
Yeah, another thing. I read in Anne Applebaum's Gulag book that even in the darkest terror period up to early 50s, when Stalin was still alive, she writes about this. I hope it's true. I don't have any other means to check it up, that once a year on Stalin's birthday, all the prisoners were collected and had to...
This is also a really good fascism litmus test as well, because you remember, he opened this by saying that he acknowledges comparisons between Soviet fascism and Nazi fascism, that he thinks that there are a lot of similarities. But remember, okay, it's the fantasy of justice, right? When American Republican fascists talk about the day where justice is done, do they imagine, like, all of the enemies of the people being arrested and then having these lengthy trials where all of their crimes are laid bare and then they confess to... No. When Republicans talk about that, they talk about, like, the day of the rope. They talk about a day of absolute and swift violence to the degenerates, where all of the people who are holding them back are swiftly disposed of. And that's why, you know, the fascists we deal with here are far closer to the Nazis than to the Soviets, though I still do believe both were fascist societies. Obviously, the CCP is far closer to the, you know, the Soviet model in terms of over-bureaucratization. Do you think the Chinese populace is fascist or just the CCP? The Chinese population is too large and varied for me to make any such statement of them. I think that Chinese people, on average, would be considered by us to be quite normal people. If you took a Chinese person from China and moved them to America and they could speak English just fine, I think that you would engage with them much as you do your neighbor or your friend or your family. The same cannot be said of a citizen of Nazi Germany. And you understand this is another critical distinction. In Soviet fascism, the apparatus of the state might be fascist, but if you talked to your average Soviet citizen, what were they? Normal. Normal, fine people. In many ways, I imagine. If you talk to an average person from China, would we disagree on something? Sure, of course there are cultural differences, but normal. If you could pull a citizen of Nazi Germany from Nazi Germany in like 1937, would they have been normal? My argument would be no, because that style of fascism relies very heavily on permanent hysteria. Sure, maybe a lot of them were normal, but a lot of them would have been kicked up into that state of permanent hysteria. And if you walk them through Times Square, you know, even Times Square back in 1937, they probably would have been sneering at every person of color, this or that. Again, I'm generalizing heavily right now, but this is another critical distinction. Is your mode of fascism, does it rely on permanent hysteria, the way the Nazis did, or not? Like, does the bureaucratic apparatus exist above you, or is it substituted with this you know, non-stop doctrine? Oh, I'm sure, Dino-Man, I'm sure, but I think it's incomparable to what you would see with the Nazis, you know. But we'll talk about it certainly soon. Yes. Does everyone understand? Yeah. This is sort of esoteric, but I think it's important to understand this stuff, and I agree with Zizek heavily in this.
Signed collectively a telegram, Gulag prisoners, to Stalin.
Yes.
Wishing him... You cannot imagine Nazis...
I also want to note, China is switching styles. I think that Chinese fascism has been heavily bureaucratized, but they are switching into more active blood and soil type shit right now. The Chinese government, the CCP, has been getting much more active in promoting and glorifying Chinese history in a martial sense, like promoting the glorious history of like 3 kingdoms Chinese warriors and the constant like militarizing with the Uyghur Muslims, the ethnic supremacy, Taiwan, the war business, the fact that they're more openly persecuting queer people, not letting gay people on TV, like all of these are signs of switching the bureaucratic apparatus as a way of bringing about like fascist governance to the hysterical mode. And keep in mind that a bureaucratic apparatus for maintaining that kind of power is one that usually relies on a narrative of improvement. Or to put it another way, the Chinese government, the CCP, its nature has been justified by the exceptional growth and prosperity of the average Chinese person over the past 30 years. Since the 1990s and onward, I guess since the 80s and onward, there has been a significant increase in the standard of living in China, and that growth legitimizes the apparatus of the CCP. Without that legitimacy, the CCP could not control their population. If the people of China were not thankful to the CCP for their efforts in supervising that economic growth, the CCP would not exist. China is too large and too diverse. It is too robust for one party to control it entirely without the public support. But there is an economic crash coming, and one happening soon as well. Between COVID, the fact that a bunch of people are about to age into retirement, the fact that the cost of living is increasing, the fact that their economy is stalling relative to like projected growth models, the fact that there's a very real possibility that they've overrepresented the strength of their economy. The CCP understands they will no longer be able to legitimize their power through the approval of the population based on economic metrics. So they are switching into more of a hysterical, it's us against the world, we need to oppose Western degeneracy type attitude. It's the exact same reason that the radical Islamic types were able to control Iran after the People's Revolution, considering the fact that most of those revolutionaries were not Islamic extremists. When the Shah was overthrown, the majority of the people who were overthrowing him, a lot of them were Muslim, of course, but they weren't radical Islamic extremists. But after the radical Islamic extremists, the Ayatollah, after they succeeded in ousting the Shah, what did they do? They killed the other revolutionaries or jailed them for counter-revolutionary activity, and have since maintained decades and decades of non-stop the West and its degeneracy are seeking to destroy us, because the Ayatollah does not have the ability to legitimize his power through that bureaucratic apparatus of economic improvement. Is what I'm saying make sense? I know that this is all rambly, but does that make sense? Even in authoritarian nations, a leader is just a leader. There's one leader and millions of people, You need to legitimize your power. And there are people like Hitler, there are people like the Ayatollah who legitimize it through hysteria and fear and constant, non-stop narratives about outside threats and internal threats. And then there are nations which are still quite fascist who maintain it through an apparatus of perceived legitimacy and competence, usually orchestrated through a bureaucracy, which achieves the same basic goals of governance while maintaining public support in a more procedural way. You could almost call it liberal fascism in a way. In fact, I think that if it wasn't for the fact that it's a ridiculous term, I would think it's almost like a fair juxtaposition.
Collecting all the Jews in Auschwitz to send a telegram to Hitler. You know what I think?
I'll give you that.
Yeah. Now, my explanation
You
is
got
a very
something there.
sad one. That's the perverted remainder of Enlightenment. In Stalinism, you can be the lowest trash, vermin, shit, but at the same time, part of you participates in universal reason, and of course, it's all staged. I know that. It's
Anyway.
But the universe of Stalinism is still a crazy universe of, again, universal enlightenment where even the lowest Trotskyite trash can be forced to participate in this universal truth reason.
Is he a Stalin supporter? No. But what he's saying here is quite pointed. The Nazi-style fascist will write off their opposition as degenerates, but the Soviet-style fascist will go, oh, the crimes you have committed against the revolution are heinous indeed, and yes, it is true that you will hang for them, but do you not within your heart not feel just a mote of guilt for that which you have committed against your neighbor, for conspiring against the revolutionary project? Will you not repent? And they did this whole song and dance, and I imagine a lot of the Soviet prisoners were probably thinking throughout all this, oh, just shoot me in the back of the head, please, God, bring me to the end of this. There's this little-known book called 1984, but if you've read it, this is the reason why the party imprisons Winston and tortures him for years, and then lets him go for a while, even though they're going to kill him anyway. Because the party considered to be in their interest to have a bunch of ghostly old men who everyone knows to have been arrested and are essentially on death row, wandering about as like icons of penitence. Yeah, to have examples made of them, but also for them to be penitent, right? Like, not just them being, you know, crucified on Main Avenue or whatever, but also to have them, like, kept around as symbols of how, you know, even these wretched souls have seen the error of their ways in the end. That sort of thing. Pretty sure the Chinese use that tactic as well. Yes, they do! In fact, if I remember correctly, in many cases, one of the conditions for release from prison in China is that you have to apologize for your crime and then, like, thank the CCP or so. That's real, right? Hold on. What kind of fascism is Saudi Arabia? I don't know if Saudi Arabia is actually fascist. I think they might just be, like, a proper theocratic monarchy. I don't know. I don't know enough about their system of governance. Islamo-fascist, I believe, is the term. Maybe. I'd have to look at it. They kind of do it with the death penalty. Death with reprieve is a criminal punishment found in the law of the People's Republic of China. Wait, this is the PRC. Wait, isn't the People's Republic of China currently in Taiwan? Is this just like a holdover term? No, ROC? Republic of China, that's it. Sorry. People's Republic of China, Republic of China. There we go, sorry. I always think of that as CCP and then like Republic of China, but I forget. If something has peoples in front of it, then that means it's communist. According to the Criminal Law, Chapter 5, Sections 48, 50, and 51, it gives the death row inmate a 2-year suspended sentence of the execution. The convicted person will be executed if found to have committed further crimes during the 2 years following the sentence. Otherwise, the sentence is automatically reduced to life imprisonment or a fixed term imprisonment if the person is found to have performed deeds of merit during the 2 years. Chinese courts hand down this form of sentencing as frequently as, or more often than, actual death sentences. This unique sentence is used to emphasize the seriousness of a crime and the mercy of the court, and is a centuries-old history in Chinese jurisprudence. Yeah, this is perfect. This is exactly what I'm talking about here. What characteristics make the USSR and China fascist if they don't have the hysteria about enemy characteristics? I always thought that was one of the defining characteristics of fascism. Well, they do, but it's different. It's complicated. I feel like the difference in the USSR and China is that they fold a lot of the goals of fascism in a social sense into governmental operation. Fascism is primarily a social phenomenon. It doesn't actually, like, describe a specific state of affairs politically, you know? Like, fascism can be present in a society with a lot of different specific governmental structures. It's not like you have to have this kind of leader, though they obviously tend to be authoritarian and, like, single leader rule. It's not necessarily the case. But I think that a lot of the structure of fascism is kind of folded into bureaucratic operation there. The hysteria still exists, but it exists as a kind of subjugated institutional force rather than as like a constant broiling flame that runs through the population. If you go by Umberto Eco's 14 Points of Fascism, which I find the most interesting and descriptive because I think that fascism is usually idiosyncratic and it usually pulls from a bunch of different sources, so it's not easy to just summarize in a single definition. A lot of the stuff here, if you look at it, all of these things apply to Nazi Germany. Most of them will apply to, like, radical elements of the GOP or, like, the Ayatollah or whatever. Like, this stuff exists. But then you take the Soviet Union, and it's present, but in a very different way, right? So the cult of tradition, after like, Lenin took power, a whole bunch of previously, like, revolutionary artists were kind of supplanted by the state. And what was it called? Like Soviet modernism? It was exactly what happened in Germany. Or not Soviet modernism. It's like this, the Soviet painting Stalin. The same thing happened in German. Soviet realism, thank you. The same thing happened in Germany, where it's like, okay, now that our leader is in charge, the only thing you can do is do, like, romantic brushstroke paintings of our leader. Literally, like, before like, the 30s, there were a ton of, like, super avant-garde painters and everything in the Soviet Union. And then when Stalin took charge, it's like, nope, that's actually counter-revolutionary. Because to the Soviet, their term for degeneracy was bourgeois, right? Because they wouldn't just use bourgeois to describe the wealthy capital owners, which described many party leaders. They would use it to refer to things like Western homosexuality or art associated with progressive movements abroad or internally. So their degeneracy was folded into a systemic economic critique, but it was being done disingenuously. In reality, they were talking about degeneracy, which is why when you look at the 30s and onward, it's like, oh, sorry, you want to learn how to paint in the Soviet Union? I hope you like painting Stalin. Or at the very least, I hope you like romantic brushstrokes. Romanticism is an artistic movement, guys. I don't mean romantic like Valentine's Day. Rejection of modernity. Well, the Soviet Union was obsessed with modernizing. Well, if you think about it, so was the Nazi Germany. I mean, they were like super big in industry. So what do they mean by rejection of modernism? Well, they mean rejection of Enlightenment values. Guys, you'll never guess what a lot of Soviets at the time referred to Enlightenment values as, considering the fact that the Enlightenment literally brought about liberalism. You know, they call liberalism social fascism, so they reject a lot of liberal institutions and beliefs for being liberal, which is what Nazi-type fascists do, but for different reasons, admittedly. The cult of action for action's sake. There was plenty of Soviet propaganda all about the new Soviet man, right? The Soviet man was strong. They tanned, they exercised, they would act quickly if they heard rumors of seditious or counter-revolutionary behavior from their neighbors or their workers, you know? They the new Soviet man was a strong man, an idealist, a soldier, a Marxist, and fundamentally a man of action. The underlying traits, I think, preserve... I'm sorry, this is so rambly. I could do this for ages. Disagreement is treason. This obviously is Soviet in nature. Fear of difference. The Soviet Union deported millions of people who belonged to ethnic minorities, claiming that those ethnic minorities were like constituencies of counter-revolutionary activity. The Soviet Union was not nominally ethnically supremacist, but in practice it absolutely was. They moved millions of people around. And the Holodomor absolutely, coincidentally, took place during a very large period of resentment towards Ukrainian ethnic groups, which was, I mean, this is like 100-year-old feud. The Russians and the Ukrainians appeal to social frustration rather than in the Nazi sense. You know, it's the German citizen is meant to be baffled and embarrassed by the ostentatiousness of the Jew. Instead, in the Soviet Union, it was more about the ostentatiousness of the piggish capitalist abroad. Of course, the difference here being that Jewish people in Germany were cool and fine, whereas members of the bourgeoisie abroad weren't cool and fine, even from a Soviet perspective. But it's still the narrative, right? They just settled on a better target there. Obsession with a plot. Stalin killed hundreds of thousands for accusations of counter-revolutionary activity. Humiliation of the wealth and force of their enemies. I don't know how much the Soviet Union did this, but in all the countries that were supported by the Soviet Union, the number one thing that they leaned on was this, right? Like, if we're talking Cuba, if we're talking Iran, Iraq, if we're talking like Latin America or Africa or wherever else, like, what do they lean on? The like anti-Western, anti-American guys. This is why so many leftists today are obsessed with anti-Americanism to the point of hysteria. This is like a fundamentalist attitude that they adopted then and continue to about like the Western aggressor that defies Marxist analysis and leans more towards just pure oppositional politics, which is what fascism relies on. This is the different types of fascism, I think. I think it makes sense ultimately to think of these both as fascist. And I think one of the best ways that you can identify that they're both fascist is that there are people today, and people back then, frankly, Nazbol types, who effortlessly switch between idealizing both of them. The Soviets and the Nazis hated each other. They worked together for a time, kinda early on, but they hated each other, and they were always going to fight, sure. But nowadays, you have people who look back on both the Nazis and the Soviets, and honestly, they just like the idea of one guy in charge, right? They just like, clearly there's some shared characteristic here that they're you know, hearkening to. Where's that other Zizek video? I'm rambling, and this is getting ridiculous. Save me from this. Zizek, a very not rambly person.
I want to begin with an old joke of mine. I hope you noticed that I joined the applause. And if you know a little bit my work, you know that I use often this example.
This is a very good one.
Why? Because I always distrusted the notion of totalitarianism. I'm not trying to save communism in comparison with fascism, that it's somehow better. I'm just saying that one should be very attentive to the distinctions between the two. What always fascinated me...
When he says communism here, he's referring to Stalinist Russia, I believe.
I'm sorry if some of you know this. Example of mine is this. Look at the old documentaries. You find all of them today on YouTube. When a fascist leader, after finishing his speech, receives applause, he just stands and receives the applause. A Stalinist leader always joins the applause. It's a totally different subjective position. The message of, and this doesn't make it any better, the message of Stalinist leader is, I'm one of you. It's not really about me. We all serve the cause. You know where you can find this difference also? I was shocked, and this is not, again, communist propaganda. On the contrary.
This is true, by the way. The whole idea was like, I am just like a civil servant. That Stalin played this role the whole time. Like Stalin was like, oh, I am not your leader. I am just a civil servant that has been chosen by the people. I am clapping now because I too am happy with how this event has proceeded. You know, we are all one together. Like that kind of shit, you know?
I found this detail in a book very critical of...
I mean, I think that, yeah, this is best exemplified by the fact that people would say Comrade Stalin. They said, you know, Hitler the Führer. Hitler's term, 2 Germans beneath him, was one of his title, whereas Comrade was just there. It was like calling him brother, you know? So the idea being that, like, you know, oh, it's not even leader Stalin, even though of course he was. It's brother Stalin, you know, friend, because he's right there, you know, next to us, on top of that giant podium with the ability to kill all of us. Big Brother? Well, I mean, Big Brother was literally modeled after Stalin, so that's not an accident.
Gulag, simply, the title is Gulag and Applebaum. You know that in Gulag, every year on Stalin's birthday, they gathered all the inmates who had to sign a telegram of congratulations to Comrade Stalin, wishing him all the best, and so on and so on. Of course, it was a ridiculous ritual. It was not serious. But the point is, why this ritual? Because just think about it. You cannot even imagine such a ritual in Nazism. On Hitler's birthday, to gather all the inmates of Auschwitz and make them sign a congratulation message to Hitler, it's meaningless. Another point, the Stalinist show trials, you know, where the tortured prisoners admit, yes, I collaborated in a plot to overthrow and kill Comrade Stalin. Such a thing doesn't...
Is he okay? Have you guys really never heard Zizek speak before? He just sounds like this.
Cannot happen, doesn't have any place in the Nazi or fascist universe. Hitler could have easily done the same. Select some visible, important Jewish figures and claim there is a plot again, and you torture them to confess. It's meaningless. Why? Because, and that's the tragedy, I'm not saying which one is better, because in Nazism, that's the horror of it. Apropos Jews, they are guilty directly for what they are. All you have to prove is that they are Jews. You then have to prove what they plan to do and so on. On the other hand, what makes Stalinism so mysterious almost is that these Stalinist enforced confessions project onto the prisoners a strange duality. You are, and they used all these terrifying terms, the Stalinists, scum of the earth, shit, and so on. But at the same time, they acknowledged to every accused prisoner the right, as it were, to step on his, her shoulders and objectively pass a judgment on his, her own betrayal. For example, the great Stalinist trials. You have there Bukharin, I don't know the big traitors for them. the prosecutor asked them, how did you become an enemy of the people? And as if from a totally objective position, they begin with, already as a young kid, I was educated by my parents to hate the working class and to enjoy exploiting them, whatever.
I think an interesting distinction then is that the Nazi fascism is essentialist at its core. So if you're an enemy of the state, it's literally in your blood. Whereas while the Soviets would act that way, while they would act as though that was true, they would pretend it was not the case. So the Soviets would displace entire ethnic communities, move millions of people, kill families because of the crimes of one person, none of which makes sense if they genuinely believed in like judicial processes that analyze the guilt of every individual. It's blood, effectively. It's if you're tainted, but the taint isn't your ethnicity necessarily. The taint is counter-revolutionary activity. And once you have that marked, you are essentially in their system a degenerate, but there's like a pantomime that goes over it. There's a pretense, there's theater that goes over it. But it's not like you could be accused of counter-revolutionary activity and then go to a Soviet, trial and argue in your defense and then get off scot-free. Like it's not, these weren't like real trials. They were political kangaroo courts, but they ran through this to give the impression that it was not like a denunciation of one's essentialist traits, of the mark of the counter-revolutionary.
But you see the paradox. You are pure shit, nobody, but at the same time you still participate in universal reason from where you can see what shit you are.
Not sure, Superjet guy.
In this sense, Stalinism is much more than fascism, what the Frankfurt School, Adorno and Horkheimer, called dialectic of enlightenment. That is to say, the terrifying, totalitarian, oppressive, however you call it, consequences, implications of enlightenment itself. But I don't want to get lost in all this. The reason I got lost in this little improvisation is just to let you know how I like to proceed. Take some small, insignificant details. Oh my
It's not a dodge, because that's exactly why I don't like Echo's 13 points. It's why I and Zizek don't really like concrete definitions of political ideologies, because it's all ambiguous when you focus on concrete. My goal isn't to do like a concrete definition of fascism or whatever, because I don't really think that's possible. It's what tendencies to look out for. I think that there's a lot of pageantry that goes into the Soviet style or the Chinese style that makes it more ambiguous in a lot of cases. I think I would say, if anything, that Nazism is like a more direct or a pure representation of fascist ideology than something that's muddled with bureaucracy or with this pageantry, I like the Nazis were so direct about the degeneracy thing. It was very straightforward for them. And that's why a lot of analysis of fascism followed and relies on the Nazis, as opposed to plenty of other fascist governments that it could rely upon. They just tend to be kind of like the petri dish example. But it's more to me about what characteristics should you look out for and be worried about. Because when I say something is fascist, I'm also saying it's bad. There are no traits I would call fascist that I would say are good. So this is like a specific set of like warning values, like things to look for.
God, look Stalin's documentary. He stands up and joins the applause. Hitler doesn't. And this is for me the proper Freudian reading, through this type of details. And then from this you pass, or you see the
Do you agree fascism is capitalism in decay? I think that's a big part of it, sure. I think that if you look throughout history, oftentimes fascism is capital owners trying to back the most radically anti-socialist and anti-communist factions within their country to maintain power. That's what's happening today in America, where like dark money billionaires back the GOP as they try to steal democracy away from us. It's not like that shit's like working class grassroots or whatever. And by the way, I'd say the same about the Soviets, because the Red Army might have been broadly proletarian, or at least aligned with the peasantry. But then what happened when they took power? Lenin and then later Stalin, who were powerful people whose power was being threatened by the realization of the revolution they had promised the people beneath them, consolidated power and immediately shut down any measure of revolutionary behavior and just, laid everything out to protect themselves. I mean, God, so many of the people killed under Stalin were essentially killed directly by Stalin to protect him, Like, a ton of the people killed in Germany were like just broad policies on the extermination of given ethnic groups or gay people or disabled people. But Stalin was out here like sweating over individual people that he had blackbagged, Like the Red Army was absolutely not aligned with the peasantry the SRs were. Am I getting my history wrong? The Red Army didn't pull heavily from the peasantry? No. The peasantry was Mao's thing. No, the Red Army was like disaffected, like urban, rural, or like urban and semi-urban poor, right? For the most part. There are other groups that were more like peasantry oriented, and those ones got more fucked over in the end. Yeah. When people talk about Maoist versus Soviet style revolutionary activities, when they say Mao, they usually mean get the peasants together and then attack from the countryside. And when they say Soviet style, they mean build up like an industrial base and like pull through that. And I think you can also see this in how both societies viewed science. In Germany, it was racial eugenics, and in the Soviet Union, it was Lysenkoism. Yep, yeah, both rejections of like degeneracy. Though in the Soviet case, they would call it like bourgeois ideology. Well, this has been a ramble. Jesus.